Yeah, I guess y'all were only half good, right? Because you get the reward of getting out of class, but the punishment is you get out of class with me. So, sorry about that. But,
I was invited.
oh,
We get
okay.
out of Mr. Taylor's class.
Yeah, that's it.
That's mostly reward, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
It outweighs.
Okay, good. Well, that puts me less on the spot.
Can you share some of the most important lessons you learned during your time as a student of linguistics and how these have shaped your research and teaching?
Most important lessons I learned as a student in linguistics. Well, I can remember some of the questions from that period, such as why am I a student of linguistics? You know, I had an excellent advisor during my period as a master's student in linguistics at the University of Georgia, Jared Klein, best teacher I've ever had. And one of the most amazing things that he did was he taught languages almost more as algebra than as languages. He taught you to figure it out as a system, right? He got you predicting things based on other languages that you knew. And just that approach to languages made such a difference to me, and just in being able to kind of learn anything else later. One thing that I was told that maybe you might reflect on down the road is when I was getting my master's, he told me for my PhD program I needed to either be a linguist with a specialty in a language or I needed to be a language guy with a specialist in linguistics. And I wound up actually at the PhD level being a language guy, Old Norse, specializing in the linguistics of that language. It's easier to get hired if you have some kind of specialization that way.
So when it comes to media things like movies and video games, such as How to Train Your Dragon and God of War, how true do they stay to Norse culture and mythology?
It depends a lot, case by case. And I'm not the accuracy police.
I wanted your opinion.
Yeah, but I just mean because I'm not the accuracy police, I often observe with blissful indifference. So I'm like, it's not my problem. I can remember a time when I felt like it was, but that was a long time ago. Something like Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed Valhalla. They made a lot of efforts to get a lot of things right that were actually tough to get right, and I really respect the effort they made. God of War, when I was looking at those clips with IGN, there were a lot of places where I thought, why on earth did they do it this way? Why is it, sometimes I understand something being wrong because it makes a smoother story or something, but it's sometimes like, where did you even get this? So I guess it bothers me less if it's done as part of a greater effort that does involve the effort to get a lot right, and it bothers me more when I feel like people just make stuff up out of whole cloth. Yeah, and those are probably kind of two ends of that spectrum. Yeah. All right, you were next.
Yes.
And then I'll just...
So, when you're translating a dead language like Old Norse, how much do you touch into daughter languages to gain context or insight? And does studying Old Norse also require partial fluency in descendant languages like Icelandic and Norwegian?
I would advise anybody who was going to do graduate level study in Old Norse, which is not that many people, but I would say you've got to know the modern Scandinavian languages. So much scholarship is done in the modern Scandinavian languages, you've got to be able to read them. It's not that hard if you know Old Norse to learn something like Swedish or Norwegian or Danish or Icelandic. I mean, the derivation is fairly transparent. I think it's pretty important. I mean, I maintain those languages, especially reading ability. I read as much in the Scandinavian languages as I read in English because there's just so much of that scholarship that's done in those languages. And I've also kind of gotten an appreciation of their literature and stuff now over time too. When I'm translating, I do bounce my translations a lot off of Swedish or Norwegian or Danish translations. I do take that as a source for mine. I look for things that other translators might have seen, but not English translations, I think I mentioned earlier, because I don't want it to influence how I phrase it. But yeah, I absolutely think familiarity with the daughter language is important if you are serious about Old Norse. Sure. Was it? You said.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was trying to make a connection with like the last question or what you just answered, like about the video games and stuff. Like in like Ragnarok, God of Ragnarok. Like I remember that one IGN. What? I remember that one IGN video that you said like about like Surge just becoming Ragnarok and like God of War lasting that. And you said like there is no like being of like Ragnarok.
Oh yeah, that is a thing in that game, isn't it? That Ragnarok is a being.
Yeah.
I forgot about that.
That was
It's like an octopus or something. I can't remember.
no, that was like a bigger like fiery version.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know. That's a weird liberty they took. I'm pretty sure I recorded those videos with IGN and then, kind of like wiped my RAM clean and sort of forgot all the specific things I had seen. Yeah, that was a weird liberty that they took now that I'm recalling it. I cannot remember that much about it. I think seeing this.
I think Tori had a question.
Oh. Do I have a horse? I wish I had a horse. I don't have that kind of money. No. So,
What would you name your horse? Just start off with that.
I don't know. I would name my horse Whiskey or Trigger or something, Like I don't mix work with life in that way. You would be amazed how many people email me asking me to name their kids.
Whoa. Do you?
No. And another genre of that is name us, right? Because when you get married, you get a free name change. So people will write to me and they'll say like, "What should our names be?" And so I actually have an assistant who gets my email, so this stuff doesn't usually filter over to me. But I remember some of the earliest requests this way. My response would be, "Look, this is a really personal decision, and I think that you should probably make it for yourself." People get mad about it. You've got a name. Like, this is an honor that I'm offering you. It's like, yeah, you're offering me a lawsuit down the line. But, yeah, I mean, like, if you visited, any space that I control, my apartment or whatever, you would see there's not Norse stuff on the walls. Like, I don't inhabit it that way, and I don't necessarily want to think of it that way. If I had kids, they would not have Norse names. Same with a horse. Trigger sounds good. Whiskey mostly not for the drink, but in tribute to Lonely Are the Brave. If any of you have seen that. Scout? Is his name Scout? Why did I think it was Whiskey? That must be another Edward Abbey book. I don't know.
Someone else with a question.
Oh, well.
How has your work as a linguist informed your broader understanding of language and communication, and what do you believe are the most important implications of this work for society as a whole?
I think one broader lesson that I take from linguistics is just that every language can basically express the same things. I don't subscribe to this notion that, we have no word for this in your English. I think Old Norse is fully as expressive as modern English. Obviously, there aren't words for microphone, but you can make up words for a particular thing. Like all languages, there's a little bit of give and take. Even when they lack some shade of meaning that's in another, they have some shade of meaning that's not in that other. So I think that it's given me a sense of appreciation for both the uniqueness and the universality of just the experience of learning and communicating with language. I think every language that I've ever learned has made me a better, at least reader of every other language. Right? It opens up kind of larger windows into how you can think about things. That sounds vague and cliche, but I think that's my answer. Wait, I think you had a hand up first.
So, what's your favorite Norse mythology story?
I don't know. The stories tend to be so short. I like the Saga of the Volsungs as a longer story. As just a shorter little vignette or something. I like Odin's ravens that fly around the world, and he's afraid for his thought, but he's more afraid for his memory. It just reminds me of an old man reflecting on, how much of what our minds is just what we remember. Is that a decent answer? Or is that too pat? All right, and then behind you.
So, Odin in Ragnarok seems to value relationships and friendships so much. And he doesn't seem to have those.
Yeah, Yeah, Odin is a huge hypocrite in a way. He's the most lonely god, but he talks about the value of friendship. He doesn't directly engage in combat himself until Ragnarok, but he encourages everyone to get into fights. Right? Actually, I think that's a really, it's a profound observation about his character. He is sort of hypocritical. But I think that's also a very easy position for a person in the role of dispenser of wisdom to get into. Right? I can sit here and give you all kinds of good advice, and I promise you that 80% of it I have violated at least twice. Right? I mean, what is the story of our lives except, the regrets and the things we learned we should have done otherwise? I think he's in very much the same position, and if anything, I think it makes him more of a wisdom figure, because he has the scars of unwisdom, if you see what I mean. I think when we think about a person of great wisdom, we don't think of somebody who's, no offense, but a teenager. We think of someone who's got the scars and the weather-beaten face of decades of experience on Earth, who's made those mistakes. And I think as you read Hofmal, he says things like, I've been drunk, I've been too drunk. Right? He's telling you not to drink too much because he's been there. And I think that's actually, in a way, that hypocrisy is central, because it's the hypocrisy that really results in wisdom, sort of. Does that make sense? You're my arbiter of what makes sense, Bob. Was that Socratic? Okay. There's some. Right?
What is your opinion of people using runes and stuff like that in modern?
Mostly it's misinformed from a medieval perspective. And I can tell that from the questions that I get about it, because people will say, well, what is the rune for love, or what is the rune for courage? Well, runes are an alphabet. So there's a rune for F, there's a rune for A, right? But there's not really a rune that means love or courage or fear or whatever you might have. So that's a big misunderstanding people have. People also misapply the wrong alphabet to the wrong language. So, for example, if you look up runes on the internet, you're mostly going to see Elder Futhark, which is an alphabet used much before the language we call Old Norse, which is actually written with the alphabet called Younger Futhark and then with the Roman alphabet. So there's a lot of mismatches there. But I think the biggest thing is the idea that each one is a symbol for a concept rather than a sound. We don't have medieval evidence for that idea.
So how many languages do you know?
I barely know one. I don't know. I can read a lot. In terms of conversation, I mostly learn languages from books. I can go to Iceland or Norway and communicate in the local language and not feel self-conscious about it. I can go to Sweden and understand the local language and then speak Norwegian, or try to kind of speak Swedish through Norwegian, and people feel self-conscious. They call it svorska, which I get tired of. But, so it depends. I listen, so orally, modern Scandinavian languages, especially Icelandic Norwegian, reading a lot, but that's just because I'm a historical linguist who learned more to pick up patterns and learned each one bit by bit by bit, right? With my strongest reading skills being in Old Norse and languages close to it, like Old English and Gothic. Old High German, that kind of thing. I think you are next. I don't have a system. I don't have a system
Oh,
here.
I just raised my hand. Did you raise your hand? Yeah, I just
Yeah?
Oh, me? Okay. You talked about your grandpa earlier. Do you have a favorite memory with him? If you don't mind sharing.
Favorite memory with my grandfather? Boy, I mean, there's so many. Man. Like, I guess I'll tell you, I can tell you one that's short-ish, that's semi-funny maybe, and gives you a sense of his character. My mom grew up in a somewhat bad family situation, and her sister wound up getting married to a guy that her parents didn't like because he was Catholic and he was a Yankee. he had the temerity to be born in Ohio.
How dare.
Exactly. And so my aunt elopes with this guy, and without her parents' blessing. I mean, they're in their 30s, if you can call that elopement. But my mom hides in the bathroom in Colorado for days, trembling because she thinks her dad is going to come up and beat her. Maybe this is getting too real. But I called my other grandfather, my hero grandfather, and I said, look, I've got this problem. Mom is terrified of her dad, and she's hiding in the bathroom, whatever. And he said, I'll be right over. He comes over, and he comes into the bathroom where my mom is. He's holding a phone, and he says, what's your dad's number? And he dials it in. He says, yep. Hey, this is June Crawford. I just wanted you to know, if you cross the Colorado state line, you're a dead man. I thought that is awesome. So it's actually my favorite memory of my other grandfather is him getting threatened with death by my hero grandfather.
Oh boy.
Yeah. But that's the kind of person he was, and he had the kind of personality. He sold it. Like you believed it. Like it was kind of casual, but kind of like, yeah, I mean it. Anyway, I thought that was great. And as a 10-year-old, I'm just kind of like, cool.
So this is. Oh, go
I don't know. I don't know what the.
Cindy, go first.
Oh, okay. So this is kind of, Adrian kind of gave me the idea of this question. I don't know how to word this very well, but you kind of touched on like people like now kind of following like Old Norse and like pagan like practices and beliefs and stuff. Do you think like from your experience in that like modern like seeing that now, do you think it's like relatively accurate, or do you think people are just kind of like making it up?
I think it varies person to person, but so much of it is by necessity made up. Because all of our texts, you look at the Eddas or the Sagas, it's stories. It's not instructions. We don't know how to pray, what kind of rituals to do, when to do them. People just search all of these old texts or travelogues or what have you, looking for any little bitty clue, but it's never enough to put together the system. So at some point, somebody is making something up. It may be a semi-educated guess, it may be just somebody saying, oh yes, I've communed with the spirits or something and they told me what to do. But there's always going to be a part of it that, from my perspective, from the medieval sources, is arbitrary. So I don't, and this isn't to utterly condemn the practice or whatever, people's beliefs are people's beliefs. And I know people that I think are very sincere in them and have beliefs that make a good difference in their lives. But just as a scholar of the medieval texts, it doesn't register with me for the most part as being the same thing.
Yeah.
Right? It's like it's like a movie that's only very distantly based on a novel that you read. It's actually a pretty good analogy, I think.
Yeah, I have a question, yeah.
Yeah.
So in the most recent, the gods are kind of kind of selfish in a way, very self-serving and violent and stuff like that. And then if you compare that to say Christianity, like God is kind of very focused and guess, and cares for people and stuff like that. So I guess I was wondering why you think that the gods behave in a selfish way, or that was the reason.
Well, I think the Judeo-Christian monotheistic God is the exception here if you're looking at worldwide systems of belief. A lot of cultures have much more neutral or selfish gods, right? They have their own motivations they're pursuing that don't really have a lot to do with us. I mean, if you look at the gods and how they interact with human beings, the main one who interacts with us is Odin, and it's because he wants to get us killed to be part of his army, right? I don't think that people loved their gods the way that people might say, well, I love Jesus, right? I don't think there's that same relationship. I don't think that relationship is possible with one of these gods, even one of the more beneficial ones like Thor, right? He's a protector figure maybe, but I don't think that there's ever a sense that like he really, really cares. It's more like we're trying to kind of, I imagine probably without knowing the details of what sacrifices and such were like, I imagine it was often, much as it seems like it was in the Greco-Roman world, an attempt to bargain with powers that are essentially kind of indifferent to us, right? Like, hey, I'm going to give you this cool animal that I'm sacrificing. You give me a better harvest, right? It's not, hey, don't you care about me? It's very transactional in a way that I think, again, like the Judeo-Christian conception of God is the exception rather than that this is like I think if you look at mythologies around the world, it's often much more like that Norse conception with those really indifferent gods. Or not always indifferent, but selfish is a good word for it. They're concerned with their own stuff.
Just the only kind of text question I had. So, in I think it's stanza 49, the stanza, I gave my clothes to two scarecrows. Once, when I walked in a field, they thought they were human. As soon as they have their clothes on, a naked man feels ashamed. Does it represent a symbolic shedding of material possession and a person pushing the scarecrows into societal expectations and norms by making them have requirements? Wow, I really went with this. Before, like, they have to have requirements before being able to feel human, or is it a moment of generosity and self-discovery through shedding of material possessions to embrace a simpler way of life?
I think you might almost be reading too much into it. My hot take is that stanza about how you put clothes on scarecrows and they feel human is wear clothes. Like, I often think Havamal is about that plane in terms of, I mean, it's very practical everyday advice. He says something else about that later too, where he says, don't go out with your hair uncombed and your something like that. I think it's mostly more like a sense that, you know, that old phrase, the clothes make the man. More a sense that what you should do is try to match your clothing to a situation that if you're not dressed well, whatever the context makes that, then you're impeding yourself.
So clothes give the shape in your self-identity.
Yeah, that's more what I see in it, but I don't think your reading is illegitimate. I just think you may actually be analyzing it more than it's asking to be analyzed, if that makes sense. But I'm a simpleton, so take that in account.
So in Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology, he says, we don't know if Ragnarok has happened or it's yet to happen. What are your thoughts and opinions on that?
I think it has not yet happened. Yeah. So there's this notion that's gotten popular that Ragnarok is a cycle.
Mm-hmm.
But if you read the text where it comes up in Old Norse, the poem Voluspa, the poem Vathruth, the Small, and then Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, they never talk about it as a cycle. They talk about one creation, then they talk about Ragnarok, then they talk about a world after Ragnarok. They don't say it's a cycle. You could see that as implying a cycle, but they never say it's a cycle. All of the time when it's talked about in any other, really in any source, it's future tense. So I don't think it's happened yet, although maybe some of the stuff leading up to it has happened. But mythic time is hard to understand because things don't happen in sequence the way they happen for us. Myths can be so dreamlike one of my favorite examples with that is actually from Greek mythology, where Hera is upset at Zeus for giving birth to Athena without her, right? Because she springs out of his head. That she gives birth to Hephaestus without him, but who chopped Athena out of Zeus's head? Hephaestus. So there's this weird cycle there. It's very dreamlike. So I think that's something to keep in mind with these sequences. Is that a handball? Hardest choice in my career path was definitely quitting teaching. I didn't know anybody else who had ever quit teaching to be self-employed. YouTube is new, right? Back in my day, there was nothing like this. If you wanted to teach, you were teaching in a classroom. Nowadays, with this option, I was the first person I knew who took this. I'm still the only person I know who's quit an active teaching career to say, I'm going to just do this online. That was definitely hard to decide. I talked to a career counselor for 6 weeks before I did it too. We met and we talked about all these different possible options, that I need to do maybe some other career entirely, or was I being stupid and thinking I could support myself? Basically, the conclusion of it all was I wasn't getting younger, so the time to try it was now. And it was a hard choice to make, and maybe ultimately it won't be the right choice, whatever ultimately means. But yeah, it was hard to make for sure. Hard call. He also made me take those career tests, right, where they tell you what your best career is and what your worst career is. So I guess I gained that self-knowledge. My worst career, flight attendant. Not good at customer service. Some people are good at it. Top career was hydrologist. So, look, I was studying some rivers. But, yeah.
Okay. So,
Right.
Since you said you were teaching, what are some common challenges that students face when learning Old Norse as a foreign language, how did you address that in your? I'm sorry. How do you address them in your teaching or any language for?
Well, with Old Norse in particular, it's got a highly inflectional grammar. Each word is different depending on its relation to other words in the sentence. So, for example, just to give you something to hang that on, when we say in English take, right, it's I take, you take, he, she takes, that's a little bit different, right? But then we take, y'all take, it's all take in the present tense. But in Old Norse, it's I takes ek tek, you takes thu tekker, he, she takes han, hon tekker, we take ver tokum, change the vowel and add a different ending. Y'all take their takið, they take their taka. So you have all these different forms. Same thing with nouns. Fjord, we just say fjord, and possessive fjords, plural fjords, but they have, depending on context, it's fjordr, fjord, fjarðar, fjörði, fjörðir, fjordu, fjarða, fjordu. So you've got 8 different forms it can take. That's tough for students because every word does that. And there's particular patterns that it falls into. And by the way, this is no easier for Scandinavians, for what it's worth, because Swedish, Norwegian, Danish have simplified this enormously. Icelandic hasn't. Icelandic is still this complicated, but that's tough to teach. Another thing that's a little bit tough in teaching modern languages, I've taught modern Icelandic and modern Norwegian too, is when we have homophones in the one language we know well, we tend to think they must be homophones in the other language. And I would see this all the time with students who were learning pretty well, but then they would say something in Norwegian like, I am the greatest ventilator of this band. Be like, what? It's like, oh, fan. They looked up fan, and they saw ceiling fan, right? And they didn't realize, oh, well, there's 2 different ways we use the word fan. We use it for that, and we also use it for like, I'm a fan of this. So as you learn more languages, you realize that there's actually lots of different senses that we embody in one homophone. it's a semi-obvious point, but it's actually fairly hard for a lot of beginning students. Does that make sense? Good.
So I just want to ask, would you like? So I asked you the first session, you were like doing the same thing, doing the same job. The good thing you said, obviously you said yourself. So, good. Do you hear me?
Kind of.
Okay. So, okay. Hold on, answer something. So somebody else is.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll return to this.
So have you ran into slang or references to lost myths when translating, and when you come and have you come at a loss to translate or make it available to people because we don't have the references, I guess? What do you do when that happens? And or has it happened to you?
I think I see two different possible questions here. One is, are there myths that are lost, that we know are lost? So yeah, I mean, there's definitely places like that. Like, there's a reference made in one poem to a time that Loki and Heimdallr fought in the form of seals. And we don't have that story anywhere. It's just like, why were they seals? Like, how did they fight? Did they fight on land or on sea? Because this makes a difference to me when I'm imagining this. Are they slapping each other with their fins? Or are they, like, I don't know how that happened. I would like to know. And there's probably some pagan guru type who's got a site that you can find on Google where he explains, oh, this is exactly how it happened, but we actually don't know. It's just sort of referred to. Or there's a poem where there's a quick reference to how Loki ate a burning heart that was on a tree, and then he gave birth to an evil woman. You think, well, what? Who? How? Huh? Who's the heart? What? How, why is the heart on a tree? And the fact is, I just don't know. Another possible interpretation of what you asked, I was just thinking, is, have I found myths that people aren't aware of? Is that what you, or did you not mean that?
I guess it could be interpreted that way. I would
Okay.
like you to answer that one as well.
Well, I mean, anything that I've seen is something that somebody else has seen before. I have tried to make people more aware of certain things that I think have been low in people's awareness. Especially stuff that's not in the Eddas, just stuff that's in a random saga or something somewhere. I've tried to increase awareness of that. I think my fourth book, The Two Sagas of Mythical Heroes, both those sagas are not well known in the English-speaking world, and part of what I was trying to do was kind of like reintroduce that into circulation, get people thinking about them again. So a little bit of that. Did you think how to formulate it?
Okay, I'm just gonna ask you a different question. So you wrote like a bunch of books. I answered this, but I don't remember. Can you answer again? What's your most favorite book that you've read?
Oh, The Wonders of Hallval. Yeah. I think it's what I want out of any book like that I would read from some other ancient tradition. I would like to find someone's, and sometimes I do have these books, like a Hebrew scholar's edition of a book of the Old Testament with the Hebrew text and the English text and a commentary on it that explains like why I made these decisions with what I did with the Hebrew. Like it's exactly what I would want from someone who's a scholar of some other language. So yeah, it's, and of course I have a very personal relationship to the text. It echoes in my head a lot. So yeah, that's my favorite.
So what's like the differences between the English and the Old Norse sentence structure?
Actually, in the introduction to the Wanderers Hallval, I take a stanza and I show you why I changed the word order, because the word order becomes unintelligible, right? I don't know if you've seen what I'm talking about, but it's in the introduction. Old Norse has a very free word order. Right, so modern English, or even the modern Scandinavian languages have developed in a lot of ways very similarly to English. But they've lost a lot of this heavy inflectional structure and become much more rigid in word order. Old Norse, because you can communicate so much just with the endings you put on words, it doesn't matter where those words are with relation to each other. So you can have the subject way after the verb and after the object in a way that's just impermissible in English, right? I mean, okay. They just randomly open to a stanza here. Advise I you, Lodfafnir, that you advice take. Enjoy will you if you take. To you will good if you get. Right? That's the original word order. The closer you stick to that, the more people's eyes glaze over. There are a lot of early translators who try really hard to stick to the original word order, but it just makes so much, like, that's not translating to me, right? If I'm not putting it in something that sounds like it's in English, then I'm not putting it in English. Like, if it calls attention to itself as a translation, I don't think it's a translation. So, kind of makes sense.
So you kind of talked about like some similarities between like Norse, like Old Norse and like other religions. Are there any like myths from like other ancient cultures that like kind of like strike you as like, whoa, this is like the exact same story as this like Norse myth, just kind of with different like gods and stuff like that?
Yeah, occasionally there are little things. I mean, some of those are not coincidences. There is an Indo-European dragon slaying myth that's got descendants in Norse and Greek and Indian tradition and Iranian tradition and Celtic tradition and Slavic tradition. And the Norse version of it is Thor fighting the Midgard serpent with his hammer. But it's extremely similar to a story of Indra slaying a dragon in the Vedas. It's very similar to a Celtic story. But that kind of stuff can be explained by the fact that it goes back to one culture, one language. What really surprises me is when you see cultures that are not related or never in contact and have little tiny details that are really similar to each other. And you can see that actually with this dragon slaying myth, because there's a very similar version in ancient Egypt, whose language has nothing to do with Indo-European languages. And, just looking at the time scale, they're 3,000 years before the Vikings, but they have a very similar story with, I can't remember who it is, if it's Osiris or Set or who it is. Maybe it's Ra. A god fights a serpent in the sea in a very similar, there's a bunch of details, like he's in a boat with one of his enemies. I think he might even have a hammer. Like, it goes very much like the Thor myth. I don't think that's because Egyptians and Vikings were in contact. I don't think by the time there was anything you would call a Viking, there was anybody who remembered that Egyptian story. But it speaks to, maybe the possibility that these motifs either wander around the world in fairly similar packages, or depending on your philosophical positions, that it's archetypal. I don't know how much I hold with that, but some people certainly take that position. So sometimes it really surprises me. This is a whole field of study, right? Folkloristics. You can find people who make catalogs of, like, this motif. They break stories down into, this motif, then this motif, then this motif, and they see these motifs all over the world. Like, there's one called the Bear's Son, which Beowulf is supposed to be an instantiation of, but there's Bear's Son stories from every continent, except Antarctica, right? But it's funny how you can find really, really similar motifs here and there. I'm more a linguist than a folklorist, but I can point you toward that stuff if you want to read more about it. Also, I just thought of another thing about your question. You asked about English language structure versus Norse language structure. So in Spanish, you say me gusta, right? I like, but it's me like. Okay, I think a lot of translators want to translate Old Norse by saying me like. It's like, no, that's not English. Yes, the word might be me in Spanish, but you obviously say I like in English. So you have to make those calls. It's like, I'm not saying this word for word, because it's not yo in Spanish, it's me. But so there's such a thing as fidelity to the message, but not necessarily fidelity to word by word by word by word.
Yeah. So kind of writing off of her question, what is like one of the more unique stories to like Norse myths?
Oh, I mean, a bunch of them are unique, right? I think that so if you read, I'm going to wander to this point a little bit. If you read fantasy literature, the fantasy literature that works is the fantasy literature that has rules, right? If you have wizards who can just do anything unpredictably, whatever, like, oh yeah, I've got a spell that does that. Yeah. There's no tension, right? But I think myth is that way too. The gods have restrictions on them. There's weird things they can't do. And it's always kind of interesting to me when they have to work around some rule. They can't just will it away. You know, Fenrir's an example. When they're imprisoning him, they can't just kill him because no, he's within our boundary. We can't kill someone within our boundaries. Another one is Baldur's death. All the gods and goddesses love Baldur so much they decide, well, we can't let him be killed, so let's make everything swear not to harm Baldur. It's like, while you're at it, make those things swear not to harm you. You know, like, why can you only make them promise not to harm him? Like, if I'm going around, if I have to go to every individual thing, every rock and every tree and say, promise not to harm Baldur, why not just say, promise not to harm any of us? Like, but it's a funny sort of dream logic where it's like, well, no, this has got to be just this one. I think that very rules-based, very restrictive world that the gods live in is a little bit unique to the Norse, because I think most gods are, in their cosmos, are more powerful than the Norse gods are. The Norse gods always seem to be following somebody else's rules, if you see what I mean. And it's like, who's that somebody else? And I think that actually inspired J.R.R. Tolkien quite a bit, because he has this pantheon of gods, right? What are they called? Something like Aesir, Valar or something. But then he talks about the shadowy one god who's actually in control, who doesn't actually do much, but they seem to be kind of operating by his rules. It almost feels like there's someone behind that curtain a little bit in the Norse myths sometimes, because the gods aren't in control of everything. I think that's pretty unique.
So we got time for two more questions, and then we need to wrap it up.
And then freedom. Freedom for y'all, I mean.
Speaking of J.R.R. Tolkien, how much if you've read the books, how much would you say Tolkien took from any kind of mythology?
A fair amount. I mean, as you read, it's most obvious if you read the Silmarillion. There's a lot of places where I think, I see exactly where he's getting this. Like the Children of Húrin, that story, there's some very obvious things he's drawing on, both in the Saga of the Volsungs, but also in the Kalevala, the Finnish equivalent, if you culturally, of the Poetic Edda. In the Lord of the Rings, there's a few places where I think, oh, I see where he's getting this. Like the sword that's broken reminds me a lot of the sword that's broken in the Saga of the Volsungs. I think that's a clear shout out, if you will, the Volsungs. So I'm not going to say that he rips everything off, but if you're familiar, especially with Norse and Finnish myth, reading Tolkien, there's a lot of places where you say, oh, okay, I see where you're getting that.
I feel like take inspiration and take creative
Yeah,
difference.
yeah. I'm not knocking him.
Of course not.
Yeah. I just mean, it's like sometimes you say, I see where you got that. Yeah. I see what you did there. I see you. J.R.R. Tolkien, I see you.
Final question.
By the way, the book that I read, that I learned Old Norse from, E.V. Gordon's Introduction to Old Norse from the 1930s, J.R.R. Tolkien is in the acknowledgments. Just as a professor, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's before anybody had any idea who he was. It was just like, thank you so much, J.R.R. Tolkien, for reading this book and giving your suggestions. It's neat to see him before fame, you know. Yeah.
Is there like something you would advise someone who's studying linguistics not to do? Not to, like, courses not to take?
I don't think this course is not to take. I think it's more like, be realistic about what you want out of it. If you're studying historical linguistics, it is not that likely you're going to make a career in academia, right? There's just not that many jobs. There's fierce competition for all of them, and most of the ones that you can get are going to be things like what I was doing with, year by year by year. That doesn't mean don't do it. It means be realistic about what comes after, especially if you have another skill set, which I don't have much of another skill set. I mean, my other skill set is sharpshooting. There's not that much I can do with that to get paid. Well, maybe the John Wick route. But I think just be clear-eyed about it, and if you love the topic and you want to study it, by all means study it. Just know what's coming after. And I've always tried to be realistic with students about it. I've tried to create opportunities for students but not to toot my own horn, not everybody tries to create opportunities for students. Some people are just trying to create students and, you know, get their credit hours and get them out the door. I try to be a little more like, all right, let's think about what you can do after this. You know, let me try to help you get on a path. But thinking about what that path is probably very helpful even at the earliest stages.